He is appalled at the destruction. It's far worse than he ever imagined, even from TV pictures. He's also struck by the anger and the thirst for, well, frankly, revenge among the crowd of rescue workers as they're there and they welcome him. They're chanting, USA, USA, USA. And Bush starts rather quietly trying to speak to the crowd, and somebody shouts, I can't hear you. And Bush finally finds his voice. Somebody gives him a bullhorn and he shouts back, I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Hello and welcome to Creating History and a series of podcasts exploring pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, documentary filmmaker and producer.
And I'm David Reynolds, author and historian at Cambridge University.
In this episode, we're diving into the complex and often tense relationship between British Prime Minister Tony Blair and US President George W. Bush in the run-up to the Iraq War of 2003. From their first meeting at Camp David in 2001 to the fraught Summitry that led to war, we'll examine how these two leaders navigated the aftermath of 9/11, the terrorist attack on New York and Washington, their drive to go to war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and the enduring consequences of their decisions.
Yes, this is a story of a partnership forged by parlays at the summit, to borrow Winston Churchill's phrase. Their summit meetings helped reshape global geopolitics and left behind a trail of controversy. I think that Blair's use and misuse of Summitry were absolutely central to the evolution of the Iraq conflict. Unlike some of the earlier episodes where we've talked about superpowers squaring up at the summit against each other, this one is about unequal Summitry. And the inequality is between a superpower and its ally, the follower trying to influence the leader and, frankly, failing. And this whole story also reminds us of how successive British governments have tried to play their much vaunted special relationship with the United States.
So, David, let's start with Tony Blair. Give us a historian's take on Britain's millennial Prime Minister.
Well, he was a graduate of what we in Cambridge call the other place.
Is that the one near Didcot?
Yep, we don't mention it. Blair studied law, though at that stage I think he was better known at university as a rock musician rather than, if you like, a legal eagle. He did become a barrister. He was drawn into Labour politics, elected an MP in 1983. Now, this guy is quick-witted and personable. He rises quickly through the ranks to become party leader in 1994. Blair's convinced that the historic Labour Party, while it must keep faith with its trades union roots, had to move into the centre ground of politics to appeal to moderate, middle-class voters. And this strategy pays off in 1997 spectacularly when his rebranded New Labour wins a landslide victory in the general election.
And then, as Prime Minister, Blair clearly relishes the limelight of the global stage.
Yes, he, like many of the leaders we've talked about, enjoys the buzz of fraternising with the world's movers and shakers. He got great self-confidence. He proved an engaging summiteer, is fluent, charming. But also, I think Summitry appealed to Blair's Christian socialist instinct to make the world a better place. It's rather like Jimmy Carter's Christian faith inspiring his Summitry at Camp David.
And that instinct for ethical interventionism was expressed early on in his premiership.
Yes, the new Labour government trumpeted, I think you'd have to say, a new ethical foreign policy. And in his first 6 years in office, Blair would order British troops into combat 5 times, more than any other Prime Minister in British history. These included conflicts in Sierra Leone and Kosovo, He had a much bigger passion for ethical interventionism than the US President, Bill Clinton. It was Blair, not Clinton, who wanted to use ground troops in the war over Kosovo in 1999, when air attacks on Serbia had failed to stop atrocities against Albanian refugees.
And then in 2001, Blair has to deal with a new American president in the White House.
Yes, George W. Bush, known as W, to distinguish him from his dad, George H.W. Bush. W has no real experience of foreign policy. His only political office before the presidency was a stint of 5 years or so as governor of Texas. Frankly, he seems out of his depth in the White House. But he'd been born into an American political dynasty. His father, George H.W. Bush, been Republican president in 1989 to 1993, so that's between Reagan and Clinton. And W's grandfather, Prescott Bush, had been a US senator in the 1950s. So I think these family political connections helped propel Bush Jr. into the White House in the 2000 presidential election. But he only just got in. His narrow election victory was decided by conservatives on the US Supreme Court.
I remember the general impression of him early on being a brash and rather insecure figure.
Yes, his verbal gaffes were notorious, and this Texan cowboy image embarrassed many intellectuals. It was widely assumed that he was the tool of strong advisors behind the scenes. Above all, his vice president, Dick Cheney, who had been defense secretary under George H.W. Bush and had presided over the war to drive Saddam out of Kuwait. But, I think Bush was his own man, really. There was a sense of his own distinctive approach to politics. He'd been a dissolute, often drunken young man, but he became a born-again Christian. He renounced alcohol, and that was evidence of strong willpower on his part, and also the stabilizing influence of his wife, Laura. As Texas governor and then as president, Bush delegated widely, but he tended to make up his own mind. And often when it came to the crunch, in a kind of quick-fire set of decisions that could sometimes cover up his own ignorance of the issues.
And then in February 2001, a month after the president's inauguration, Blair met Bush for the first time at Camp David, and rather unexpectedly, they clicked.
Yes, expectations, I think, weren't very high, a British socialist meeting an American Republican president, but the ice quickly broke, and the leaders were soon on to first-name terms. Blair, I think, found Bush more incisive and capable than the cowboy image suggested. And it was a relaxed kind of event. Dinner, movie, brunch the next morning helped to cement the sort of personal bond that grew very rapidly. And Blair presented Bush with a facsimile of Churchill's draft of the Atlantic Charter of 1941, evoking the heyday of Anglo-American summitry. And this was a calculated move, nodding towards that historic alliance between Churchill and Roosevelt during the Second World War, and suggesting that Blair and Bush were now part of the same tradition.
And I remember there was awkward humour at their joint press conference.
Yes, when the leaders were sort of gushing about their relationship, a reporter asked what they had in common. Was it sports, music, religion? So slightly embarrassed silence, and then Bush says, we both use Colgate toothpaste, which I think he knew about because it was, if you like, standard issue in the Camp David cabins. So the meeting became known as the Colgate Summit. The real thing they had in common was, in fact, religion. Bush was a born-again evangelical who'd renounced booze. Blair's faith was more private, but it blended, if you like, Anglo-Catholicism and Christian socialism. Both men's view of geopolitics was filtered through Christianity.
So then everything changes on 11th of September 2001. This was a real hinge point of history.
Yes, we sort of take it for granted now that something happened on that date. It's part of the history books, but you've got to remember the enormous, terrible shock of watching that unfold on television during that day. An attack on the heart of America's finance and government. 2 hijacked planes destroying the giant, huge twin towers of the World Trade Center near Wall Street. Another plane ploughing into the Pentagon, which is the nerve center of America's defenses. And a 4th finally forced down by courageous passengers en route to attack the White House. I mean, that's an amazing and unbelievable sense of threat and damage right at the heart of America. I think the death toll is now stated to be 2,977 Americans who died as a result of that terrorism by Islamic fundamentalists from Al-Qaeda. That's more than the number of Americans killed at Pearl Harbor 60 years before. And remember, Pearl Harbor is 2,000 miles away from the continental United States, not right along the eastern seaboard. So this is a day unlike any other in US history, and it creates a sudden sense of existential insecurity. And it makes Cold War concepts of containment or détente suddenly seem totally irrelevant. And that sense of shock and panic, really, is something we've got to grasp in order for us to understand Bush, Blair, and their Summitry. And it's interesting, it came home to me in a different way when I visited the Bush Presidential Library in Dallas. And the museum there is very cleverly laid out. The first room you enter is like the elementary school classroom in Florida, where Bush happened to be sitting that morning. He was on a visit there, listening to children read. It was kind of a bizarre little photo opportunity. And he's suddenly given the first news of the 9/11 attacks. And then the visitor turns the corner into another much bigger room, which reveals the full horror, the full enormity of that day. Images of devastation in New York and Washington, and then America's global response. So you're turning from that tiny little moment into, a horrific new world.
And 9/11 gave Bush a new sense of mission.
Yes, absolutely. It's worth remembering that the first few months of his presidency, insofar as there was a very clear foreign policy, he was beginning to focus on China, which of course is now in our own day very much at the center of America's concerns. But now he had to think in a totally different way about the Middle East and about the threat that existentially was being posed to the United States. So he goes to New York, of course, he tours the ruins of the Twin Towers a few days after the attack, and he is appalled at the destruction. It's far worse than he ever imagined, even from TV pictures. He's also struck by the anger and the thirst for, well, frankly, revenge among the crowd of rescue workers as they're there and they welcome him. They're chanting, USA, USA, USA. And Bush starts rather quietly trying to speak to the crowd, and somebody shouts, I can't hear you. And Bush finally finds his voice. Somebody gives him a bullhorn and he shouts back, I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
And so Bush declares a war on terror.
Yes, a war on terror. That's a term that was deliberately vague and open-ended. But on the 20th of September, Bush tells a joint session of Congress, our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. And he decides to retaliate against Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan, but also at the Taliban regime in that country, in Afghanistan, that had been hosting them.
And Tony Blair famously promises to stand shoulder to shoulder in that fight. So this is the special relationship all over again.
Yes, Blair's one of the first world leaders to visit what became known as Ground Zero in New York. And he too was appalled at what he saw. You know, it's truism that nothing prepares you for the job of being president or prime minister. But 9/11 was a huge step up again. And as Christians, both Bush and Blair felt themselves suddenly sucked into really an apocalyptic battle between good and evil. And nobody knew where the next bombshell might come from.
And so this was becoming almost a kind of crusade for both of them.
Yes, Bush actually uses that term initially, but then he's warned about Muslim sensitivities going back to the medieval crusades. But whatever was said in public, both leaders, I think, did have a crusading sense of mission. And other NATO allies often got fed up, particularly with Blair, who was shuttling all over the world to win support for Bush. One French official complained, there is not a single problem that Blair thinks he cannot solve with his own personal engagement. It could be Russia, it could be Africa. The trouble is, the world is a little more complicated than that. But Blair was unrepentant. He totally disagreed. He said, it's a strange paradox that in today's world, in some respects, governments are less powerful, but at certain critical moments, governments are very, very powerful indeed. And the personal relations between people are of fundamental importance, far more so than might be guessed from the outside. So he said, you need to be able to know that you can trust the other person, the other leader, if you like.
The essence of Summitry. But then, I suppose, Bush gets carried away after the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan. He expands his war on terror with Saddam Hussein of Iraq in his sights.
Yes, indeed, it's striking that as early as September the 12th, the day after the terrorist attacks, Bush is asking his counterterrorism czar, Richard Clarke, I want you, as soon as you can, to go back over everything. See if Saddam did it. See if he's linked in any way. Now, Saddam Hussein's repressive, brutal regime and his defiance of UN weapons inspectors had long been an obsession, a bugbear for neocons, who had an essentially black and white worldview that starkly pitted good against evil. And with, of course, the Americans leading the goodies. And they argued that with the Cold War now over and the US the world's sole superpower, Bush should exploit that advantage, that unipolar advantage, without worrying about international institutions, particularly the UN. And I think there's probably also a personal angle there as well. Back in 1991, after Saddam had invaded oil-rich Kuwait, Bush's father, that's President George H.W. Bush, had painstakingly assembled an international coalition, including Gorbachev's Russia, to drive the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. But Bush did not stretch that fragile coalition too far by pushing on from Kuwait, from the liberation of Kuwait, into Iraq itself to try and topple Saddam. It was assumed that his regime would soon crumble now from within after that defeat.
But that didn't happen.
That's right. But, you know, Bush Sr. was by instinct and experience a multilateralist, a UN man. Bush Jr. was instinctively more aligned with the neocon worldview, more unilateralist, now with a messianic sense forged in that crucible of ground zero. He wanted to complete the job left unfinished in 1991 and maybe go one better than his father. Who knows? Anyway, W's administration developed a strategy to justify preemptive attack, and that strategy became known as the Bush Doctrine.
So this was a peak moment for the neoconservatives. 9/11 was an opportunity to remake the world.
Yes, neocon advisors like Paul Wolfowitz at the Pentagon and particularly Vice President Dick Cheney claim that removing Saddam could begin a wholesale democratization of the Middle East in the American image. And in November 2001, Bush instructs his Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, to start working up a war plan to go into Iraq. In the new year, the January 2002 State of the Union address, Bush raises the stakes by singling out Iraq, together with Iran and North Korea, as all parts of what he calls an axis of evil, linking them all together as supporters of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But Iraq is the particular fixation for Bush. And in March 2002, he tells senior senators, expletive deleted, Saddam, we're taking him out.
This doctrine of preemptive attack would be intensely controversial, of course, and it starts to fracture the goodwill that's been building up towards America and the international coalition that had been formed after 9/11.
Yes, Blair finds himself increasingly isolated as Bush's sole significant ally, certainly the most zealous ally in this build-up to war. He's caricatured in cartoons as almost America's poodle, but what he's trying to do, I think, essentially is stick to what's really a key axiom of British foreign policy ever since World War II, which was to keep in with the White House at almost any cost. The way I would put it is that London's mantra when dealing with any US administration was, and still is, never say no, say yes, but, with the yes said firmly in public and the caveats, the no's, made quietly behind closed doors. And I think Blair had little or no doubt about the wisdom of this approach. In any case, like Bush, he's a true believer in toppling Saddam. He's long warned about the dangers of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, in the hands of rogue states. And in fact, in 1998, Blair and then US President Clinton had mounted a 4-day blitz on Iraq, hoping to force Saddam into cooperating with UN weapons inspectors, because this suspicion of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was long-standing.
And there was a personal dimension to this. Blair had a tendency to trust his gut instincts, often shutting out dissenting voices.
Yes, like other can-do prime ministers over the decades, Blair shunned the Foreign Office and its regional specialists. He was much happier relying on his own inner circle, rather like Chamberlain relying on Horace Wilson before World War II, which was something we explored in our podcasts on Munich 1938. Similarly, Blair's gut instincts were not subjected to rigorous challenge. There was a sort of cocoon around him. He got no time for skeptics. He paid little attention to inconvenient details. You guys sort it out, he'd tell officials. He was ready to go to war if it seemed necessary, and he believed that he could solve the problems that going to war might cause through his Summitry, his special relationship now that could restrain Bush.
This week on True Criminals, Fugitives.
There's no way in my mind my dad could have been a bad guy, so...
What did your mum tell you?
Well, first of all, my dad came into my room because I looked out of the window wondering what was going on, and I heard someone shout, "There he is," and I looked down and there was, as well as a lot of police outside my bedroom window, there was a lot of journalists and taking pictures, and I thought, what is going on? This is most unusual. Then my dad walked in with Tommy Butler, and he just said, "Look, son, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Daddy's been a very naughty boy."
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. with fresh psychological insight and untold stories. Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
So the Bush-Blair alliance was forged in 3 more summits during 2002 and 2003.
Yep. So the first one was in April 2002. They met at the president's ranch near Crawford, Texas, again, informal. There's no official agreement about whether to attack Iraq or when. But Blair comes away with no doubt about the way Bush's thinking is going. And effectively, he agrees in principle to support military action to bring about regime change in Iraq. But he does try to extract some assurances from Bush on the sort of yes, but lines.
What were the buts?
Well, Blair wanted efforts to build a coalition. It wasn't just to be Anglo-American. He wanted to make progress on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Remember, that had all got sort of sidelined since the days of Jimmy Carter and Camp David that we talked about earlier on. And he also wanted a new UN weapons inspection of Iraq to really check out whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But these conditions that he was stating in private were overshadowed, I think, by his public declaration of support. It was easy for Americans in the administration and outside to hear the public yes and forget the quiet but. And this eventually led to accusations that Blair had simply been too ready to concede.
Yes, I mean, in a 6-page memo dated from July 2002, it's now declassified and cited by the Chilcot inquiry into the war, Blair wrote to Bush saying, "I will be with you, whatever." And that was long before UN weapons inspectors had done their work. Blair also says the removal of Saddam would free up the region. Wasn't the problem here that Blair played his card of British support too early and too eagerly? It meant there was just no wriggle room for more cautious voices in both governments.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in support of what you're saying, it seems that US Secretary of State Colin Powell would have been happy if the British had pressed more strongly their arguments for restraint. Powell was now finding himself increasingly sidelined in Washington by the neocons, and they were moving steadily and deliberately toward whatever the State Department said. In August 2002, Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, simply claimed there's absolutely no doubt that Saddam was amassing weapons of mass destruction to use against America and its allies.
Did the British believe that?
Well, Richard Dearlove, the head of Britain's intelligence services, felt that military action by the US was becoming inevitable, but he said the intelligence and the facts were being fixed around the policy. Dearlove and the specialists in the Foreign Office also warned that there was little discussion going on in Washington about the likely aftermath of military action. What would be done if and when the troops had displaced this Saddam's regime? What would be put in its place? Now, it's true, I think, that Blair was alarmed at the slide, almost the rush to war, and the fact that little progress had been made on his conditions. He did manage to arrange another summit with Bush at Camp David in September 2002, but it was now very, very hard to navigate almost the riptide within the Bush administration. And it's striking that at this summit, Dick Cheney sat in on their meetings. Sat in, said one British official, like a lump. He was a kind of intimidating presence in the room with an evident influence on Bush. Remember, this was the man who had been right at the heart of the war in 1991 that had failed to remove Saddam. And I think Cheney's presence, his influence on Bush, undermined Blair's efforts to persuade the president one-on-one.
Despite that, though, a deal was struck.
Yeah. So Bush did promise that he'd pursue diplomacy if the UN did manage to deliver genuine disarmament of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. And Blair, in return, promised that he would support war if the UN failed to get that genuine disarmament.
Famously afterwards, Bush told Blair's entourage, "Your man has cojones."
Yep, he'd got balls in plain English. So this is another awkward moment of camaraderie, but I think it shows up the tension between Blair's public and private positions. Now, let's be fair to Blair. He'd forced a short delay in the rush to war, and that's quite an achievement given this huge momentum building up in Washington. Cheney and Rumsfeld had already penciled in a date of 15th of February 2003 for the start of war. But after fierce infighting, it was agreed that the US would ask for another international resolution to send UN weapons inspectors in yet again.
So Blair now had some breathing space.
Yes, but the point was that a gulf was opening up between Bush and Blair's real reason for war, which was regime change, and the one they presented in public, Saddam's possession and likely use of WMDs. Blair's clear that he can't take Britain to war just to topple another leader. That would be totally unacceptable in international law or to British public opinion. So Number 10 Downing Street mounts a propaganda campaign that cherry-picks intelligence material to highlight the potential threat and ignore or downplay the doubts. It's a 50-page digest of material, later dubbed the Dodgy Dossier. It was published on the 24th of September 2002, and it's just a blatant exercise in spin. It includes a foreword by Blair that stated, Saddam's military planning, quote, allows for some of the WMDs to be ready within 45 minutes of an order to use them. 45 minutes of an order to use them. Now, that claim was based on a single, uncorroborated source, and no such WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, have ever been found. The government was doing anything it could to exaggerate the threat posed by Saddam and make the case for war.
The 45-minute claim was a defining moment in the run-up to the war, and it was picked up by millions of Blair's critics. B-Liar became his punning nickname.
Yeah, but I think calculated self-deception may be more what's going on here. Blair passionately believed he was right. Remember, he's been a barrister. He's used to selecting and massaging the best pieces of evidence, even closing his eyes to inconvenient evidence in order to make his case. The problem is that he's now not in a court of law. There's no rival lawyer here to make an opposing case from the other side. As Prime Minister, Blair is operating solo as both advocate and judge.
It's a classic case of confirming your biases and ignoring the rest. And the story now heads to the UN, where there's a lot of doubt and division. The UN Security Council does pass Resolution 1441 on 8th November 2002, but it's only after 6 weeks of haggling because France and Russia were sceptical of the intelligence evidence.
Yes, Resolution 1441 imposed a tough inspection regime on Iraq, but it threatened only, quote, serious consequences if Iraq failed to comply. And even then, only after another consultation at the UN Security Council. So the opposition in the resistance is gradually weakening in this slow, attenuated process. Iraq allows UN weapons inspectors back in. The inspectors then ask for more time to complete their work. France and Germany supported that request, and Rumsfeld denounced them as old Europe, out of touch with the new global realities.
And then at the end of January 2003, Blair meets Bush at the White House for their third summit.
Yes, Bush was prepared to delay war, But in reality, I think this was only because the Pentagon needed more time for military preparations. Blair raised the question of a further UN resolution, but he found everyone in the White House opposed, including now the more dovish Colin Powell, the Secretary of State. Cheney and Rumsfeld, pumped up for war, were ready for America to go it alone if the Brits kept dragging their feet. So Blair keeps pleading his case as a domestic imperative. Otherwise, he warns British opinion is going to revolt. Bush promises he'll try to help Britain, but at their press conference after the meeting, although he says he would welcome a second resolution, he claims that 1441, quote, gives us authority to move without any second resolution. So this undercuts Blair and it retains the administration's freedom of action.
And then Secretary of State Colin Powell is sent to make the case at the UN. His speech there in February 2003 presented the intelligence, later discredited, about Iraq's alleged WMD programs. The speech was meant to sway skeptical nations, but even Powell looked unconvinced. And that's not surprising because later he admitted the speech had actually been written by Cheney's office.
Yes, Powell said afterwards that that speech was one of his greatest regrets, a real blot on his record. The French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin's speech at the UN, by contrast, just days after Powell, warned of the dangers of unilateral action and openly questioned the evidence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, I vividly remember de Villepin's dramatic delivery and real scorn.
Yeah, de Villepin says, in this temple of the United Nations, we are the guardians of an ideal, the guardians of a conscience. And this kind of language and France's stand galvanizes international opposition to the war, particularly in Western Europe. But of course, it did strain Franco-American relations. This is now the period in American popular culture when the French become known as, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. And some restaurants rebrand French fries as freedom fries.
And there's fallout in Britain too.
Yes. Thousands, millions maybe, marched in London against the war. Blair gives the cabinet and parliament the opportunity to discuss the issue, but only on the basis of information carefully spun by Press Secretary Alistair Campbell's machine. There are several cabinet resignations, including, interestingly, that of Robin Cook, who'd been Foreign Secretary in Blair's first term, and he was the one, ironically, who had designed New Labour's ethical foreign policy.
So the Americans went to war against Iraq on 20th of March 2003, with Britain as their only substantive ally.
Yes. The campaign starts with airstrikes on Baghdad, shock and awe. Blair tells Bush, this is the moment when you can define international politics for the next generation, the true post-Cold War world order. Our ambition is big. Construct a global agenda around which we can unite the world rather than dividing it into rival centres of power.
Of course, it didn't quite work out that way.
No. I mean, the campaign itself is brief. That's true. And on the 4th of April, the US forces have reached Baghdad. On the 1st of May, the president proclaims an end to major combat operations in Iraq. And he does that standing on the deck of the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln under a banner saying mission accomplished. Well, that was a serious PR mistake, a rare one, I think, but a mistake that would haunt Bush as Iraq descended then into anarchy and into civil war for the rest of his presidency. If you look at the statistics, I think up till the 1st of May, so that's mission accomplished, the war had cost only 139 American lives. By the end of 2006, the death toll is over 3,000. So that's now a greater American death toll than the fatalities from 9/11. Bush plows on. A request that he makes for yet more appropriations in February 2007 pushes the total cost of the Iraq war in real terms beyond what was spent by the US in Vietnam. So in 2007, there's a surge of troops, and that does reduce some of the street violence. It allows the administration to start withdrawing some of the military forces. The focus now shifts to finding a plausible exit strategy for winding down a war that had cost more than 4,400 American dead by the summer of 2010 and over $800 billion. And that's just in the direct cost of military operations. The larger costs are much greater than that. As for Iraqi dead, well, the lowest credible figures range from maybe 100,000 to 150,000. Many estimates reckon at least 500,000 Iraqi dead.
Really shocking figures. In its rush to war, the US hadn't planned meaningfully for peace.
Yes, that's right. I mean, quite a few people pointed to what had happened in 1945 in preparation for the occupation of Germany and its demilitarization, its denazification, a slow, ordered process which had been planned carefully. In the case of Iraq, the Americans didn't try to work with Iraqi institutions or make use of some of the former bureaucrats, police and military, if only to keep order for the moment and handle the transition. It's possible that an attempt to change the regime incrementally might have helped stabilize the country. But instead, when there's massive looting and anarchy, Rumsfeld simply says, stuff happens. Freedom's untidy. Despite the huge investment of US troops and money, Iraq disintegrates into civil war from which the main beneficiaries would be Shia militants and neighboring Iran. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, who'd foreseen this danger in 1991 at the end of the war to push Saddam out of Kuwait, reportedly dissented from his son's invasion of Iraq.
And Blair, too, soon saw the looming problem. His triumphant tone changed after he visited Iraq in June 2003. The task is absolutely awesome, he told Bush, and I'm not sure we're geared for it.
Yeah. And by the autumn of 2003, there's almost a tone of panic entering into Blair's letters to Bush. Iraq on the ground is tough. We lose people to terrorist attacks. We haven't found enough on WMDs. In the international community, there's a sense of schadenfreude. Blair and Bush started this. It's their problem. Let them sort it out.
But even then, even with all this, Blair didn't waver in his support for this war.
That's right. He's in too far. He just couldn't turn back, so he just doubled down. He wrote to Bush saying that the struggle for control of Iraq would determine the spirit of the future world. We have to be absolutely unapologetic. And that broadly has remained his position since. When the Chilcot inquiry into the causes and handling of the Iraq War finally reported in 2016, Blair acknowledged that their report made, quote, real and material criticisms of preparation, planning, process, and of the relationship with the United States. But he also cited sections of the report that, he said, should lay to rest allegations of bad faith, lies, or deceit. And he declared that, quote, whether people agree or disagree with my decision to take military action against Saddam Hussein, I took it in good faith and in what I believe to be the best interests of the country.
Right. Looking back over the period from today, what do you think Blair could have done differently?
Well, that's a great what-if of Blair's premiership. Would history have been different if he'd taken a different path? I don't know. He could have decided that Bush's case was unproven, but that would have been contrary to his whole philosophy of ethical interventionism. He could have asked tougher questions about post-war planning, but the Middle East experts in Whitehall have been pretty much cut out of the policy-making process. He could have refused to go to war, but that would have run up against Britain's strategy of supporting a US policy in public in the hope of modifying it in private. And that was the essential point of the special relationship on which he, like most British post-war prime ministers, had staked their whole foreign policy.
Would going against the special relationship have been so bad?
Well, possibly not. I mean, it's worth remembering that in the 1960s, Harold Wilson, a Labour Prime Minister of that time, resisted repeated pressure from American President Lyndon Johnson to send troops to Vietnam, and British-American relations were not permanently damaged. That's where I think you've got to bring in 9/11 again. Blair's predicament wasn't the same as Wilson's because of what happened on that day in New York and Washington. Remember what I said about the impact on Bush and Blair of standing at ground zero in September 2001. Nobody could forget that moment, and certainly not the President and the Prime Minister.
Yeah, but what Blair got from Bush and what Bush gained from Blair was very unequal. Blair essentially gave Bush cover to disregard international opinion and the whole world order.
Well, it's true that Blair didn't derive much advantage from cooperating with Bush. The administration stayed on the UN track for longer than the Hawks wanted, but in the end, the British and the Americans went to war without UN backing, and no progress was made on the Israel-Palestine issue, which was so important to Blair. On the other hand, Bush gained great benefit from Blair. Having a real ally on the ground, speaking the same language, more or less, helped to swing the American public behind the war. And had Blair said a firm no, instead of yes, with a sotto voce, but it's possible that Bush might not have felt able to go ahead on his own. But then you have to remember the ferocious pressure on the other side from Washington Hawks. They saw 1991 as an unfinished mission.
And there's also self-deception here with Blair. He saw in Bush what he wanted to see and what he wanted to hear.
Yeah, I think that's right. One British official put it like this. He said, Bush listens politely. He agrees that the points being made are good. He says things like, I'll do what I can. But as soon as Tony's in the air, on his way back home, Bush forgets the conversation, and we know he has forgotten. Now, it's true that Blair famously did this sort of thing to others, and promising things to his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, and then not following them up. But I think he found it hard to see when others were doing it to him, particularly the President of the United States. Perhaps he couldn't afford to. He couldn't afford to see it that way. Like Chamberlain with Hitler or Churchill with Stalin, he's invested too much in Bush to be honest with himself about their relationship.
Blair is sometimes compared to Anthony Eden, who also took his country into a botched war on false pretenses during the Suez Crisis. But doesn't a comparison with Neville Chamberlain fit better?
Well, I think there are similarities between the three prime ministers you mentioned. They're all struggling to keep up with the rush of events. But I agree that the Blair story has several distinct echoes of Chamberlain's Summitry. You've got a well-intentioned leader, convinced of his rightness, whose confidence in his powers of persuasion border on hubris. Chamberlain also squeezes out, excludes the professional advice. He relies on an inner circle, and his rhetoric, publicly, like that of Blair and Bush, becomes more and more extravagant during the crisis. Maybe this is the voice of a man who privately knew that he'd gone too far to turn back.
One last thing. We mentioned George W. Bush's father earlier. His approach to the original Gulf War in 1991 was obviously a huge contrast to his son.
Yeah, George H.W. Bush didn't stretch his international coalition too far or exceed its UN mandate. And that, I think, reflected his deeper experience. Bush Sr. had been ambassador to the UN, envoy to China, CIA director, and vice president under Reagan. Bush Sr. is also a big believer in institutions like the UN and NATO, seeing them as, if you like, essential tools for maintaining global order. And he's also a veteran of the Cold War. He's lived right through that period. He understands the volatility and the fragility of global order. That's why he creates a coalition that includes prickly countries like Russia and France, as well as Arab states such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So, big contrast there with his son. W enters the White House in 2001 with minimal foreign policy experience. He's lived for more than a decade in a world in which there seems to be only one superpower. And he's also been hit by a shock unlike anything that was experienced by his father or any Cold Warrior, 9/11, when New York and Washington are under direct and devastating attack. Father and son were different men living in different eras.
And those differences had enduring consequences for America and for the New World Order that Bush Sr. famously prophesied after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Indeed. In the first Gulf War, Bush Sr. has a clear plan and a defined exit strategy. But in the second, Bush Jr. assumed that toppling the tyrant would bring about victory and a new democratic Iraq in America's image. And that simply didn't happen. The ensuing chaos and conflict seriously damaged America's standing on the world stage. The failure to find any weapons of mass destruction, that was the main legitimation for the invasion, undermines America's moral credibility. And by going into Iraq and exacerbating its problems, the US creates a power vacuum that led to the rise of the Islamic State in the 2010s, an even worse form of extremism than Al-Qaeda, and it led to years of instability across the Middle East. So the US was pulled into a series of open-ended interventions that have been costly in lives and money, and also deeply unpopular with Americans. These were known as the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They fueled isolationist tendencies back home, turning away from global responsibilities, or else maybe they fed into Donald Trump's MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. The longing for a day that has, frankly, never really existed, when the US simply told the rest of the world what should be done.
Yeah. Thanks, David, for your insights. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this journey through the complex and controversial relationship between Tony Blair and George W. Bush. And David, I think you've teed up very nicely the next episode about a president who goes way beyond the 18th hole. Next time on Creating History, we'll bring our story up to date with the Summitry of Donald Trump, drawing North Korea's Kim Jong-un in from the cold, practicing the art of the deal, or perhaps not, with Russia's Vladimir Putin, and trying out a more transactional policy in the Middle East. Join us then. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there, or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.